Next up, we have Dr. Carrie Meidenbauer from JHU APL. Johnny alluded to it. It was news to me that the TSA administrator signed the document, our recommendation. He told me before. He didn't spring it on me while I was sitting there. But I'm happy to hear that because we worked hard over last year. Congress had dictated in the appropriations language and is a working group put together by all the stakeholders. We came up with, we had already been working on some kind of breeding consortium concept with Hopkins and S&T, and a large, the majority of the recommendations that went back. There's still some things to be worked out. The procurement, for instance, we still have a gap with that, but we finally got some traction with some support from Congress and industry folks to really put together what we're calling kind of a breeding consortium, where we're taking advantage of the breeders. And we've tried certain government federally sponsored breeding programs. They've worked to a certain degree, but that's not what we recommend. And there's breeders out there, there's dogs available, there's willing partners. We want to be able to take advantage of that knowledge and help the working dog folks, not only the TSAs and the federal partners, but also the state and local guys who are, they're going to shelters. They need some help with this. We also want to apply some science to be able to get to a better product at the end of the day. Carrie's going to talk about this effort that we're piloting within S&T to do that. It's encouraging that the language is moving up through Congress, because we're hoping this pilot sets the stage and works out some of the bugs on a smaller scale that we hope we get support to ramp up on a larger scale. So, Carrie, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for bearing with us. So I'm the last technical talk, and you're all still here, so that's good. But my name is Dr. Carrie Meidenbauer. I'm a member of the JHU APL team, and I'm their staff veterinarian. And I'm also the technical co-lead for the Explosive Detection Domestic Breeding Consortium that is sponsored by DHS S&T. And my other co-lead, David Deglow, is also here. So once I go through this, I'm doing like the 10,000-foot view. There's lots of technical details on this. I could brief you for hours, which nobody wants me to do. So please come up and ask us questions afterwards. I'm happy to dig into any of the details. All right. So a little bit of background to look back at what initially drove this effort. So back in 2018, the DHS Appropriations Act came out, and it was focusing on the need to meet the increasing demand for explosive detection canines. It was looking at and evaluating the feasibility of developing a dedicated breeding program, and it really wanted to focus on what the cost would be for something like that, the length of time something like that would need to start up, as well as how do we differentiate between the quality dogs that might come out of such a program and the current dogs that we procure from overseas and from the current venues that we get dogs from. In addition, it was looking at how TSA could do a department-wide breeding program versus just a department-specific one, because of the numerous challenges we've had in the past with department-specific programs. In addition to this effort, S&T was also tasked under the Appropriations Act to look at this from a scientific perspective. So we wanted to look at how do we integrate best practices in genetics, genomics, breeding, olfaction, as well as behavior training and physiology and metrology. In addition to this, as it was just referred to, during the HR 302, we were tasked to set up a working group. And so we did sit on that working group, and thankfully the conclusions that came out with that group of technical experts paralleled beautifully with the effort that we have already started in the pilot that we're beginning this year. And so as this last bullet it's been confirmed that it actually is supported by the TSA administrator, which is great news as I move forward and start talking about the details here. So the objective, so why are we doing this? Initially it was to meet that congressional call. In addition, we have an expanding need and no availability really of domestic supply for explosive detection canines. Right now, a great number of our dogs do come from overseas, and there's a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, with that. First, The continuity of supply is a huge issue, the issues of political influences and cultural challenges, and then also getting the dogs here is a huge issue. So we have to go on these buy trips, collect the dogs, bring them back, test them, and then if they fail, the issues with missed opportunity costs with that too are huge. We're also interested in developing a line of canines that are suitable for not only the immediate needs, but as well as the long-term demand. So our needs in this space have changed drastically over the last 2 decades and even the last decade to meet, the challenges our adversaries are placing in front of us, and, how do we enhance this technology to be even better to meet those challenges. Our goal is to take a scientific-based approach that can endure and improve over time, as well as collaborate with the current infrastructure. So how do we do this without reinventing the wheel? There's huge groups of canine advocates and breeders and different interest groups out there. How do we build into that structure versus trying to build a parallel one that's not as successful? In addition, we want to be able to develop a qualitative, unbiased improvement methodology for selection and breeding of working dogs. Don mentioned the focus on EDCs is for this project, but also what do we do with those dogs that don't meet the EDC requirements? So if we're breeding dogs, obviously not every dog bred out of this program is going to be the perfect EDC. We hear trainers who can look at a litter and pick out 3 puppies and be like, they're going to be great, the rest of them I don't care about. So how do we take that knowledge that the trainers has just from experience and create something that's measurable and quantitative to select those dogs reliably to go to their EDC discipline and be operational canines? And how do we take the other dogs and figure out where they fit best? If we're breeding with intention, these should all be good dogs. So maybe they'll be great search and rescue dogs, or maybe they'll be great seeing eye dogs. How do we take them and apply them to different disciplines? So that's part of this as well. And also minimizing the lost opportunity costs, as I mentioned, decreasing dropout rates, increasing acceptance rates, and most importantly, increasing the operational lifespan. We want to create a community with this. So one of the other interesting things is if we think about canine interest groups in the United States, there's tons of them. We have the AKC and the breed-specific interest groups. We have the Seeing Eye Dogs are a great example of what that looks like to create a culture and a community that supports breeding and tries to really improve their specialty dogs. Also, hunt dogs, they're great at that, but we don't have anything like that currently available for the EDC. We have a couple testing things out there, but a lot of inconsistencies across the community. So how do we as a group develop a culture and a community around EDCs that'll support developing high quality dogs to meet not only government needs, but needs as a whole as the nation? And then most importantly is that this consortium will develop a working canine data bank. And so this will be a national resource that we can use for years to come. Right now we have really minimal data for longitudinal studies of operational canines and very minimal data on early development strategies and how do we take these puppies and create good dogs. So that's a huge component of this project as well. The 4 major components of this effort are shown here. I'm going to touch on them here, and then I'll get a little bit more into technical detail, but as I said, we're keeping it high level because this is short. First is phenotype characterization, which is the quantitative evaluation and identification of canines' health, as well as physical and behavioral characteristics. So if you're not familiar with the term phenotype, it's going to be the outward manifestation of genetic traits. So if you think about it, the overall health of the dog, the behaviors that they display, and what we're interested in. Canine selection, so incorporating phenotype evaluation with operational needs and using weighting factors to select that optimum canine. And then we have our breeding and development, selecting breeds and developing explosive detection canines by use of the consortium approach and supporting other facets of the program. And last but not least, the genotype effort, which is a part of this as well, is looking at combining biological sampling with health and performance data to develop models that inform the breeding and user community for the goal of advancing breeding and occupational expectations. So out of those 4 circles, we're getting 4 primary products out of the consortium as well. Now these products will be available to the whole user community as well as all consortium participants, and they're going to be the phenotype survey, which is an evaluation of the dog's traits that's pulled together. So basically all of the traits that we're looking for that we want operational canines to have. We also have the canine selection tool, which is the application of that phenotype evaluation. So how do we collect those things and then weight them to understand what kind of traits, like how much of this trait do we want to see in a successful dog? And you can choose based on that and potentially apply to other disciplines, change the weighting and say, this is actually the weighting of those traits I want for a seeing eye dog or search and rescue dog. Also, obviously, the outcome of this consortium is going to be program source canines. We want dogs. So you saw those huge numbers that Mr. Diller posted. TSA has a growing demand, and that's not the only agency interested in explosive detection canines. So how do we meet that growing demand with domestically sourced dogs? And last but not least is using that genotype effort to develop predictive health and performance models. So I'm going to fly through these a little bit just because we're going to be time tight here. But the phenotype characterization overview. So we want to look at what are the quantitative measures that we can use to look at the dog. We want to identify and categorize phenotypes based on existing knowledge base, and we've been pulling that from the user community and from the research community. So there's a ton of different evaluations out there for dogs. And I say dogs as a whole because there's not many specific for working dogs. There's a ton for pet dogs, but what characteristics, what phenotypes are we looking for in a successful operational canine? So first we got to classify all of those phenotypes, and then we got to figure out how much the presence or absence of that trait is desirable in the end user or in the operational canine. And so that's been a huge part of this phenotype survey. And then also developing an evaluation where a non-subject matter expert can go in and look at these dogs at different ages. So looking at puppies, how are these traits being displayed in puppies? How are they being displayed in young dogs? How are they being displayed once the dog's trained, and the differences that training can have on those traits? And really capturing what's the natural manifestation of the phenotype versus the trained one. And so that's all components of this, and weighing it so we can quantitatively select those dogs with a scientific backing. The canine selection tool with that, so it comes into how do we apply that phenotype characterization, so the traits that we're defining, how do we then apply it to selecting a successful EDC or other occupation as well. We're looking at specifically canine-based factors as well as end-use derived factors. So that's including, availability of the dogs, how do you pick based on what's there, and then also time to train, service lifespan. And the huge part of canine selection too that we're looking at with this is where the phenotype meets the end user. So that came up a few times, is this is for the end users. We want to get these dogs into the hands of the operational handlers and the end users. So the canine selection tool is for them to be able to go in there with scientific knowledge without us having to teach them about phenotypes or genotypes or all of the crazy science things that get really complex. But they can take this tool and then use a scientific approach to pick a dog. The genotype effort, so at a high level, the big thing is using canine genetics to establish a scientific knowledge base of working canines. The models will be used to support and inform breeding decisions, health and longevity, training and socialization practices, and canine selection. And the goal is that we see both immediate and long-term benefits in breeding, training, and the overall EDC canine product. Plus, existing traits that have been mapped in other breeds can now be selected or avoided, which is huge. So using those blood sampling techniques, we can do genotyping, look for specific traits of interest or concern, and then select based on that. So this is going to parallel and partner with the phenotype survey. And we can also study things like epigenetics or training. So how does the environmental factors influence the genetic makeup of the dog? And how do we select or avoid things based on that as well? So this is going to be a really interesting part when we look into how this applies to predictive health and performance modeling. And the big thing I want to focus on with this too is it's all iterative. So each one of these factors informs the other one. And so as we continue down this track in the pilot of this program, each litter will give us more information to build the previous tools more and expand upon them. And last but not least, our program sourced canines. So before I run out of time, I do want to touch on, so this is the structure of the consortium right now. We have two entities. We have breeding collaborators and private partners. Our breeding collaborators are going to be our larger academic institutions with a bit more of a robust ability to breed 3 or more litters a year and really do something with a bit more academic background to it. So we have partners like Auburn that are going to be participating. We're really looking forward to seeing where the scientific component can come out of the relationship with those entities. We also have our private partnerships. We've been jokingly saying the mom, paw breeders, but not necessarily that, but just smaller entities that aren't quite as robust and large and supported as an academic institution, but breeders that are able to use their knowledge base to better this program. And they have a ton of knowledge and are frequently overlooked. We also want to help support them with scientific resources and gain their knowledge base to help inform future products. Plus, one of the challenges that I know has been brought up is the issues with procurement. So, larger entities can set up contracts with the government and do procurement, much more streamlined process, but that's really not something that smaller breeders are capable of doing. So how can this program help those smaller breeders get the quality dogs into the hands of, government entities? And in addition, we want to help them expand their ability to breed as well. So the consortium will give them breeding abilities to get to dogs that they never previously would have access to. The nice thing about this structure is that S&T will help direct the breeding, but they do not own or house any of the dogs. All of that is still in the hands of the breeding collaborators and private partners. And at the end of the day, so there's funding for the data relationship between DHS S&T and the collaborators, for the data flow to support them participating in the consortium, and for the reports back basically on the early learning strategies in the process. And then from there, those dogs will be sold directly to the user community, with the primary focus being on explosive discipline dogs. And so to wrap up, why would somebody want to work or be a part of this consortium? So there's compensation for time spent dedicated to the effort. There's a potential higher profit for the litter. You'll get access to the phenotype assessment, genetic testing for medical conditions, and the canine selection tool as well. Also, there'll be participants of the consortium and can tote that as part of their repertoire as a breeder, and expanding and diversifying their breeding pool and access to really high quality dogs. So along with this, I do want to note that there is an APL RFP supported by S&T that's coming out mid-December. So anybody who's interested in potentially participating in the consortium, we'd love to meet you and talk with you and get you some more information. Mike House, David Deglow, and myself will be at the tables, and so please come up and chat with us. We look forward to talking with you more. But thank you so much for your time.